Pennsylvania, 1927. The autumn breeze carried the scent of decaying leaves through Millbrook, a small town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. James Harris, a 42-year-old former journalist turned amateur photographer, stood on the porch of his newly acquired Victorian home, observing the property with mixed emotions. The house, a looming three-story structure with ornate gables and a widow's walk, had been surprisingly affordable. Too affordable, perhaps. "It's quite something, isn't it?" his wife Margaret said, joining him on the porch. Her voice carried a hint of uncertainty. "It needs work," James admitted, "but it's ours." He wrapped an arm around his wife, pulling her close against the October chill. Their two children, Elizabeth 10 and Thomas 8, ran across the overgrown lawn, their laughter a welcome sound after the long drive from Philadelphia. Margaret leaned against him. "Do you think we did the right thing, James? Moving the family so far from the city? The newspaper business is dying, Maggie. My photographs will sell better from here, closer to nature, to real stories." He didn't mention his declining eyesight, the real reason he'd left his position at the Philadelphia Inquirer. The doctors had given him 2 years, perhaps 3, before the darkness would consume his vision entirely. The Harris family spent that first day exploring their new home, discovering creaking floorboards, stuck windows, and peculiar wallpaper patterns. The children claimed their bedrooms, Elizabeth choosing one overlooking the backyard garden, while Thomas selected a smaller room with a window seat. That evening, while unpacking his photography equipment in what would become his study, James discovered a trapdoor in the ceiling. "Thomas, fetch me the stepladder from the moving truck," he called to his son, who had been watching him with curious eyes. Once the ladder was positioned, James climbed up and pushed open the trapdoor, coughing as decades of dust rained down. Using his electric torch, he illuminated a vast attic space, its rafters draped with cobwebs. "Can I come up, Father?" Thomas asked, excitement evident in his voice. "Let me make sure it's safe first," James replied, pulling himself into the musty space. The attic stretched the length of the house, filled with abandoned furniture and trunks. As James swept his torch across the space, the beam caught something reflective in the corner, a large, ornate mirror leaning against the wall. Beside it sat several cardboard boxes. Curiosity piqued, James approached the boxes and opened the top one. Inside were stacks of photographs. Not the modern Kodak prints, but older daguerreotypes and early silver gelatin prints. As a photographer, he couldn't resist examining them. The images showed a family, mother, father, and 3 children, posed formally in this very house. The photographs spanned years, the children growing before his eyes as he flipped through them. The final photograph in the stack made James pause. It showed the family in the attic, standing before the same mirror he'd just discovered. But something was wrong. While the parents and 2 of the children cast shadows against the wall behind them, the youngest child, a girl of perhaps 6, cast no shadow at all. James stared at the photograph, a chill running down his spine despite the attic's stuffy heat. He turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink was a single line. "Emily's shadow departed on Tuesday last. The doctor says she has 3 months. Ugh. Father, may I come up now?" Thomas called from below. James quickly returned the photograph to its box. "Not today, son. It's getting late, and your mother will have dinner ready soon." That night, after the children were asleep, James showed Margaret the photograph. "It must be a defect in the development process," Margaret said, though her voice lacked conviction. "These old techniques were imperfect." "Perhaps," James agreed, not wanting to worry her. "I'll look through the rest tomorrow." Later, as they lay in bed, the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old house keeping them awake, Margaret whispered, "James, do you know why the previous owners sold this place so cheaply?" The realtor mentioned they left suddenly. Some family emergency back east. "Did you notice there's a small cemetery on the edge of our property, near the tree line?" James hadn't. "We can explore it tomorrow," he said, squeezing her hand reassuringly. But in the darkness, his thoughts returned to the shadowless child and the ominous note on the back of the photograph. The next morning, Elizabeth complained about strange noises coming from her closet. "It was like someone was scratching to get out," she said over breakfast, her blue eyes wide with genuine fear. "Old houses make all sorts of noises," James explained. "The wood expands and contracts with temperature changes." "It wasn't the house," Elizabeth insisted, "and my room got so cold I could see my breath." Margaret exchanged a concerned glance with James. "I'll sleep in your room tonight if you're frightened," she offered. "I'm not a baby," Elizabeth protested, though relief flashed across her face. After breakfast, James returned to the attic, bringing his camera equipment. He wanted to recreate the photograph of the family by the mirror, to see if some trick of light or positioning might explain the missing shadow. The attic felt different in daylight. Dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight that streamed through small, grime-covered windows. James set up his tripod before the mirror and looked at his reflection. The mirror's silver backing had deteriorated in places, creating dark blotches that distorted his image. As he worked, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he expected to see Thomas, who had been eager to explore the attic. Instead, he saw nothing but the open trapdoor. "Thomas! Elizabeth!" he called. No answer came. Turning back to the mirror, James froze. In its reflection, he could see a small figure standing behind him, a girl in an old-fashioned dress, her face obscured by shadow despite the direct sunlight falling upon her. James spun around, heart pounding, but again saw nothing. When he looked back at the mirror, his reflection was alone. With trembling hands, he packed up his equipment and descended the ladder, closing the trapdoor firmly behind him. That afternoon, James walked to the small cemetery Margaret had mentioned. Hidden among overgrown weeds and surrounded by a rusted iron fence were a half-dozen gravestones. The largest bore the name Blackwood, which James recognized as the name of the family who had built the house in the 1880s. Beside it were smaller stones for Josephine Blackwood, Harrison Blackwood, and William Blackwood. Off to the side, partially obscured by tall grass, was a smaller stone. James brushed away the weeds to read the inscription, Emily Blackwood, 1887-1894. Her shadow went before her. The same phrase from the photograph. James felt the blood drain from his face. Walking back to the house, he noticed Thomas playing near an old well at the edge of the garden. "Thomas, stay away from there," he called sharply. Thomas looked up, startled by his father's tone. "I was just looking, Father. I think something's down there." "What do you mean?" James asked, approaching cautiously. "I dropped a stone in, but it didn't make a splash. It sounded like it hit something soft." Thomas demonstrated by dropping another pebble into the well. Instead of the expected plunk of stone hitting water, there was a muffled thud. James peered into the well's depths, but could see nothing in the darkness below. "The well must have dried up," he said, trying to convince himself as much as his son. "Stay away from it nonetheless. It's dangerous." That evening, while reviewing more of the attic photographs, James discovered the Blackwood story. The photographs, accompanied by journal entries tucked between them, revealed that Emily, the youngest daughter, had begun acting strangely in the summer of 1894. First, her shadow had begun to fade, eventually disappearing entirely. Then she started speaking of the people in the mirrors who wanted her to join them. The final journal entry, dated September 18th, 1894, read, "Emily is gone. We told the authorities she fell ill with fever, but the truth is darker. She simply vanished from her bed. Only her nightgown remained, and the bedroom mirror was found shattered. May God forgive us for bringing her to this cursed place." James closed the journal, his hands shaking. The Blackwoods had lost their daughter to something they couldn't explain, something connected to the mirrors, the shadows, and this house. That night, Elizabeth's screams woke the household. James and Margaret rushed to her room to find her pressed against the headboard, pointing at her closet door, which stood slightly ajar. "She was there," Elizabeth cried, "a girl in an old dress." "She has no shadow, Father. and she wants me to go with her." James pulled open the closet door to find nothing but Elizabeth's dresses hanging neatly in a row. But the air inside the closet was unnaturally cold, and a faint scent of lilacs, a detail he would later find mentioned in the journal as Emily's favorite flower, lingered in the air. "You're having nightmares," Margaret soothed, though her face had gone pale. "Come sleep with us tonight." As they left Elizabeth's room, James noticed something that made his blood run cold. In the moonlight streaming through the window, Elizabeth cast no shadow on the wall. The following morning, James visited the Millbrook Public Library, seeking information about the Blackwood family and their home. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Abernathy, narrowed her eyes when he mentioned his address. "The old Blackwood place," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "My grandmother used to work there as a housekeeper. That family came to no good end." "What happened to them?" James asked, leaning forward. Mrs. Abernathy glanced around, though they were alone among the stacks. "The official story is that the youngest girl, Emily, died of consumption. The family moved away shortly after. But my grandmother—" She hesitated. "My grandmother said the girl didn't die of any natural cause. She said that house has something wrong with it. Something in the walls, in the mirrors." "The mirrors?" James felt a chill despite the library's warmth. The father was obsessed with photography and mirrors, had them installed all over the house. My grandmother said he was trying to capture something with his cameras, something he believed lived in the reflections. She pulled out a bound volume of local newspapers. "Here, this might interest you." The book was open to an article dated October 1894. The headline read, "Local photographer claims breakthrough in spirit photography." The article described how Harrison Blackwood, amateur photographer and wealthy industrialist, claimed to have developed a technique to photograph what he called the shadow realm, a place he believed existed parallel to our own, visible only through reflective surfaces. Most dismissed him as a grieving father, driven mad by his daughter's illness, Mrs. Abernathy explained. But my grandmother believed he was onto something real, something dangerous. James borrowed every book he could find on the Blackwood family, local history, and phenomenon of spirit photography, popular in the late 19th century. As he was leaving, Mrs. Abernathy gripped his arm. "If I were you," she said, her eyes intense, "I'd cover every mirror in that house. And whatever you do, don't let your children look into them for too long." When James returned home, he found Margaret in Elizabeth's room, packing a suitcase. "What are you doing?" he asked, setting down his books. "I'm taking the children to my sister's in Pittsburgh," Margaret replied, her movements jerky with barely controlled panic. "Just for a week or two, until we decide what to do about this house." "What happened?" James asked, noting the dark circles under his wife's eyes. Margaret stopped folding Elizabeth's dress. "This morning I couldn't find Thomas. We searched everywhere. Finally, Elizabeth said she heard him talking in the attic." She took a shuddering breath. "James, he was standing in front of that mirror having a conversation with his reflection, except the reflection wasn't mimicking his movements. It was beckoning to him." "Where is he now?" "Downstairs with Elizabeth. I haven't let them out of my sight since." Margaret resumed packing. "There's something wrong with this house, James. Elizabeth's shadow is growing fainter. I noticed it yesterday, but today it's undeniable, just like in that photograph you found." James wanted to argue, to find a rational explanation, but he knew what he had seen in the cemetery, in the photographs, in Elizabeth's room the night before. "Go to your sister's," he agreed. "I'll stay and find out what's happening here. Once I understand it, we can decide whether to leave permanently or find a way to make this house safe." After Margaret left with the children, the house felt eerily silent. James spent the day reading through the materials from the library and examining the Blackwood photographs. He learned that Harrison Blackwood had become obsessed with spiritualism after the death of his oldest son, William, who had drowned in the well on the property. Convinced that William's spirit was trying to communicate from the other side, Harrison had filled the house with mirrors and cameras, believing they could serve as portals or windows to the realm where his son now existed. The more disturbing revelation came from Harrison's private journals, which Mrs. Abernathy had included among the borrowed materials. In them, Harrison described how his experiments had succeeded beyond his expectations, but not in the way he had hoped. Instead of finding William, he had opened a connection to what he called the Shadow People, entities that existed in a parallel dimension and could only interact with our world through reflections. They hunger for substance, Harrison wrote. They envy us our solidity, our shadows. They take the shadows first, then the soul follows. According to the journal, these entities had been responsible for Emily's disappearance. Harrison believed they had lured her through a mirror in her bedroom, the same room Elizabeth had chosen. James's reading was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Opening it, he found Mrs. Abernathy standing on his porch, clutching a small wooden box. "I found something you need to see," she said without preamble. "My grandmother kept it hidden all these years." Inside the box was a small hand mirror with its reflective surface painted over with black paint. "This belonged to Emily Blackwood," Mrs. Abernathy explained. "My grandmother took it after the girl vanished. There's something written on the back." James turned the mirror over. Scratched into the wooden backing were the words, "They come through the silver. The paint keeps them out." Harrison Blackwood wasn't just photographing these shadow people, Mrs. Abernathy said grimly. He was inviting them in. "My grandmother believed he actually wanted them to take Emily, that he offered her to them in exchange for William's return. But why would they want a child's shadow?" James asked, struggling to make sense of it all. "My grandmother said the shadow is like an anchor to our world. When they take it, it becomes easier for them to pull the person through to their side." She clutched James's arm. "Your family is in danger. If your daughter's shadow is fading, they've already begun the process." That night, James couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the house seemed menacing. Around midnight, he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his bedroom. Grabbing his torch, he stepped out to investigate. The hallway was empty, but at its end, the trapdoor to the attic stood open. The pull-down ladder extended. James was certain he had closed it. Steeling himself, he climbed the ladder. The attic was bathed in moonlight streaming through the small windows, illuminating the large mirror in the corner. As James approached it, he noticed something odd. His reflection seemed delayed, moving a fraction of a second after he did. Then his reflection stopped moving entirely, though James himself had frozen in place. The reflection smiled at him. A cold, empty smile James knew had never crossed his own face. "Where is the girl?" his reflection asked, its voice a distorted version of his own. "You sent her away. Bring her back." "Who are you?" James demanded, his voice shaking. "We are the dwellers in silver," the reflection replied. "We have waited so long for new shadows. The Blackwoods left us hungry. What do you want with my daughter?" The reflection's smile widened unnaturally. "Children cross over more easily. Their shadows detach with little resistance. We need new substance to sustain us." "You'll never have Elizabeth," James declared. The reflection laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "We already have her shadow, photographer, and shadows always find their owners. She'll return to this house, drawn by what she's lost. They always do." Backing away from the mirror, James stumbled against one of the cardboard boxes, sending photographs scattering across the floor. One landed face up at his feet. The image of Emily Blackwood, standing before this very mirror, her shadowless form a stark reminder of what threatened his own daughter. His reflection continued to move independently, watching him with predatory interest. As James reached the trapdoor, it called after him, "We'll wait, photographer. We've waited decades already. What's a few more days?" James slammed the trapdoor shut and ran to his study. Working through the night, he developed a plan based on Harrison Blackwood's journals and Mrs. Abernathy's grandmother's belief that the entities came through the silver backing of mirrors. The next morning, James began systematically covering every reflective surface in the house with black paint, just as had been done to Emily's hand mirror. As he worked, the house seemed to resist. Pipes burst, flooding rooms he had just finished. Windows shattered inexplicably, and the temperature dropped to near freezing despite the mild autumn day outside. By evening, every mirror save one had been covered, the large mirror in the attic. James saved it for last, knowing it would be the most dangerous to neutralize. According to Harrison's journals, it was the original portal, specially designed to thin the barrier between worlds. Armed with paint, a hammer and determination, James climbed the ladder to the attic. The space was unnaturally cold now, his breath fogging before him. The mirror seemed to glow with an inner light, though no external source illuminated it. As James approached, brush in hand, he saw not his reflection but a gathering of shadowy figures. Among them stood a small girl in an old-fashioned dress, Emily Blackwood, he presumed, and beside her, partially transparent but unmistakable, stood Elizabeth. "Elizabeth!" he cried out, rushing toward the mirror. The figures scattered, revealing his own reflection once more, but changed. His reflection's eyes were hollow voids, and its smile stretched impossibly wide. "She's not here yet," it said, "but she's coming. She feels the pull of her shadow. Even now she begs her mother to return home." In that moment, James understood the truth. The entities couldn't fully take someone who was unwilling. They needed to lure their victims through willingly. That's why they took shadows first, creating an unbearable sense of loss that would draw the victim back to seek what was missing. With a cry of rage and fear, James hurled the paint can at the mirror. The glass cracked, but didn't shatter. His reflection distorted, its features stretching and melting like wax near flame. "You cannot stop what has begun," it hissed. "The girl will return. And when she does, we will take more than her shadow." James grabbed his hammer and struck the mirror's surface with all his strength. The glass exploded outward, showering him with razor-sharp fragments. A howling wind erupted from the broken frame, a wind that seemed to contain a multitude of screaming voices. Then silence fell. The attic was just an attic once more, dusty, cluttered, and ordinary. The mirror frame stood empty, its glass scattered across the floor. James sank to his knees, picking up a photograph that had been beneath the mirror. It showed the Blackwood family, complete with Emily, and this time all their shadows were intact. On the back was written, "Family Portrait, Spring 1894, before it began." Rushing downstairs, James called Margaret's sister in Pittsburgh. When she answered, he asked desperately to speak with his wife. "James, we were just about to call you," Margaret said when she came to the phone, her voice thick with worry. "Elizabeth is insisting we come home. She says she's left something important behind. She won't eat or sleep. James, her shadow, it's completely gone now." "Don't come home," James urged. "Not yet. I've discovered what's happening, but I need more time." "What is it, James? What's happening to our daughter?" James hesitated, knowing how impossible it would sound. "The house. There's something in the mirrors. The same thing that took the Blackwood girl 30 years ago. It's trying to take Elizabeth too." There was a long silence on the line. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice steady despite the madness of what she'd just heard. "Tell me what to do." The plan was simple, but dangerous. James would use Harrison Blackwood's own research against the entities. If mirrors were portals, perhaps they could be used not just as entrances, but as traps. Over the next 3 days, James worked feverishly, converting his photographer's darkroom into a workshop. Following Harrison's detailed notes, he constructed a device the man had designed, but apparently never completed. A camera with mirrors arranged in a precise configuration that Harrison believed could capture and contain the shadow entities. Mrs. Abernathy assisted, bringing additional journals and materials she'd found hidden in her grandmother's possessions. Together, they learned that Harrison had ultimately fled the house, not out of grief for Emily, but out of fear. In his final journal entry, He described how the entities had grown strong enough to partially manifest in the physical world, no longer confined to reflections. "They're coming for me now," Harrison had written. "I hear them in the walls, see their movements from the corner of my eye. I offered them Emily to save William, but they want more. They always want more." On the fourth day, Margaret called with alarming news. "Elizabeth ran away," she said, her voice breaking with panic. "She took the morning train. The station master said she bought a ticket to Millbrook." "When will she arrive?" James asked, his mouth dry with fear. 4 o'clock this afternoon." James looked at the clock. It was just past noon. "I'll meet her train. Under no circumstances are you and Thomas to come back to the house. Promise me, Margaret." After extracting her promise, James and Mrs. Abernathy accelerated their preparations. The device, which Harrison had called the light trap, was nearly complete. It resembled a large camera on a tripod, but with multiple lenses and small mirrors arranged in a complex pattern. "Will it work?" Mrs. Abernathy asked as James made final adjustments. "Harrison believed it would not just capture the entity's images, but their essence," James replied. "Like a soul catcher, he called it. And if it doesn't work?" James had no answer for that. At 3:30, James left for the train station, leaving Mrs. Abernathy to make final preparations at the house. The plan was to intercept Elizabeth before she could enter the house. If the entities needed her to come willingly, they would ensure she never crossed the threshold. But when the 4 o'clock train pulled into Millbrook Station, Elizabeth wasn't on it. Panic rising, James questioned the conductor, who confirmed that a young girl matching Elizabeth's description had indeed boarded in Pittsburgh, but had disembarked at Harwich, the stop before Millbrook. Harwich was 5 miles away, too far to reach quickly without a car. James rushed to the town's only taxi service, only to find it closed for the day. Desperate, he borrowed a bicycle from a sympathetic shopkeeper and began pedaling frantically toward home, taking every shortcut he knew. As he approached his property from the back fields, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. In the fading light, he saw a small figure approaching the house from the main road. Elizabeth, her blue coat unmistakable even at a distance. "Elizabeth!" he shouted, pedaling harder. "Stop! Don't go in the house!" Either she didn't hear him or chose to ignore him. She climbed the porch steps and disappeared inside. By the time James reached the house, dusk had fallen. The windows glowed with lamplight, though he knew Mrs. Abernathy would have only lit the lamp in his study where the light trap was set up. Approaching cautiously, James peered through the front window. The entryway was empty, but he could hear voices from upstairs, a child's laughter followed by an older woman's urgent tone. James entered silently, grabbing the crowbar he'd left by the door for protection. As he crept up the stairs, the voices grew clearer. "You must come with me now, child," Mrs. Abernathy was saying, her voice strained. "This house isn't safe." "But I need to find it," Elizabeth replied, her voice oddly flat. "I left my shadow here. They said they'd give it back if I came home." "Who said that, Elizabeth?" "The people in the mirrors. They've been talking to me in every reflection, even in Pittsburgh." James reached the second-floor landing and saw them standing in the hallway outside Elizabeth's room. Elizabeth's back was to him, but he could see Mrs. Abernathy's face, pale with fear, her eyes darting to something behind Elizabeth that James couldn't see. "Elizabeth!" James called softly. She turned, and James nearly dropped his crowbar in shock. His daughter's face was gaunt, her eyes hollow and distant. Most disturbing of all, she was now entirely shadowless, even in the direct light from the hallway lamp. "Father," she said, her voice emotionless, "you broke their mirror. They're very angry." "Who's angry, sweetheart?" James asked, moving slowly toward her. "The shadow people. They say I have to go to the attic to get my shadow back. They say I have to go through the frame." "Mrs." Abernathy shook her head in warning. "James, there's something in the house. I've seen it moving in the dark corners." As if on cue, the hallway lamp flickered and dimmed. In the momentary darkness, James glimpsed movement along the walls. Not shadows cast by physical objects, but shadows moving independently, flowing like liquid across the surfaces. When the light stabilized, the moving shadows vanished. But James knew what he had seen. The entities had grown strong enough to begin manifesting outside of reflective surfaces. With Elizabeth in the house, connected to them through her stolen shadow, their power was increasing. "Elizabeth, we need to go to my study," James said calmly, though his heart pounded. "I have a special camera there that can help get your shadow back." Elizabeth tilted her head, as if listening to a voice only she could hear. "They say it's a trick. They say only they can give me back what I've lost." "They're the ones tricking you," James insisted, kneeling to meet her eye level. "Remember what I taught you about photography? How the camera captures light and shadow. My new camera can capture your shadow and return it to you." Uncertainty flickered across Elizabeth's face, the first real emotion she'd shown since entering the house. "Mrs. Abernathy will take you to the study," James continued. "I need to get something from the attic first." "The attic?" Elizabeth repeated, her eyes suddenly focusing. "Yes, we should all go to the attic." "No," James said firmly. "You go with Mrs. Abernathy. I'll join you soon." After a moment's hesitation, Elizabeth nodded and took Mrs. Abernathy's outstretched hand. As they headed toward the stairs, James moved toward the attic trapdoor. He had a secondary plan, one he hadn't shared with Mrs. Abernathy. Harrison's journals had mentioned a ritual, a way to close the portal permanently. It required something personal from the one the entities sought, in this case, Elizabeth, placed within the empty mirror frame in the attic, followed by specific words Harrison had transcribed from what he claimed was an ancient text. James had dismissed it as superstition, focusing instead on the more scientific-seeming light trap. But now, faced with the reality of moving shadows and his daughter's transformed state, he was willing to try anything. Climbing into the attic, James found the space transformed. The broken mirror no longer stood in the corner. Instead, its empty frame hung on the wall directly opposite the trapdoor, a rectangle of deeper darkness against the gloom. As James approached it, he felt a cold so intense it burned his skin. His breath crystallized before him, falling as tiny ice particles to the floor. The empty frame seemed to pulse with dark energy, and as he watched, the darkness within it began to swirl like smoke. From downstairs came a sudden crash, followed by Elizabeth's scream and Mrs. Abernathy's shout. James turned to go back, but the trapdoor slammed shut. He rushed to it, pushing with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. "Your daughter belongs with us now," said a voice behind him, a chorus of voices really, speaking in unison. James turned slowly. Within the mirror frame, the swirling darkness had coalesced into a vaguely human shape, or rather, several overlapping shapes, as if multiple people occupied the same space. "You have no claim on her," James said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We have her shadow," the entity replied. "Soon we will have all of her, and then, photographer, we will have you and the old woman too. Your shadows will sustain us for years to come." "Why?" James demanded. "Why do you need our shadows?" The entity's form rippled, almost like laughter. "In our realm, nothing casts a shadow because nothing is substantial. We are thoughts without form, desires without bodies. Your shadows give us weight, substance. Each one we take makes us more real in your world." From below came the sound of footsteps on the stairs, light, quick steps that James recognized as Elizabeth's. "She comes," the entity said, its many voices tinged with satisfaction, "called by what she has lost." James looked frantically around the attic, seeking anything he could use as a weapon or a barrier. His eyes fell on a small trunk he hadn't noticed before, shoved under the eaves. Pulling it out, he found it contained photography equipment, specifically flash powder and bulbs from the early days of photography, likely belonging to Harrison Blackwood. An idea formed. If these entities were creatures of shadow, perhaps intense light would harm them. The trapdoor began to rattle as someone pushed from below. Working quickly, James set up several flash powder trays around the mirror frame and connected them with fuses made from strips of paper. From his pocket, he took the one item he'd brought, a lock of Elizabeth's hair, saved from her first haircut and carried as a good luck charm. He placed it on the floor before the empty frame. The trapdoor burst open and Elizabeth climbed through, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if she were a marionette controlled by unseen strings. Behind her came Mrs. Abernathy, her face bloodied from a cut above her eye. "I tried to stop her," Mrs. Abernathy gasped, "but the shadows, they're everywhere downstairs. They pushed her toward the attic." Indeed, looking down through the trapdoor, James could see the hallway below was filled with undulating darkness, shadow stuff that moved with purpose, flowing up the walls and across the ceiling. Elizabeth walked toward the mirror frame, her eyes fixed on the shifting form within it. "They have my shadow," she said, her voice dreamy. "I need to go through to get it back." "Elizabeth, stop!" James lunged for her, but a tendril of shadow shot from the frame, wrapping around his ankle and yanking him backward. Mrs. Abernathy grabbed Elizabeth, holding her back as the girl struggled with surprising strength. "The light trap!" James shouted to Mrs. Abernathy. "We need to bring it up here." "It's too late," Mrs. Abernathy replied, her voice breaking as she struggled with Elizabeth. They destroyed it. Shadows knocked it over and crushed the lenses. James felt despair wash over him. Their primary defense was gone. All he had left was Harrison's ritual and the flash powder, neither of which he fully trusted. Elizabeth broke free from Mrs. Abernathy and stepped toward the mirror frame. The entity within reached out with appendages of shadow, caressing her face with what almost seemed like tenderness. "Come home, little one," it crooned. "Your shadow misses you." Elizabeth took another step forward, now just inches from the frame. James could see her form beginning to waver, becoming translucent at the edges, as if she were fading into the darkness. In desperation, James struck a match and touched it to the paper fuses. "Close your eyes," he shouted to Mrs. Abernathy. The flash powder ignited with a blinding burst of white light and a sound like thunder. The entity in the frame shrieked, a noise so horrible it seemed to rip through the very air. The shadow tendrils retracted, and Elizabeth stumbled backward, temporarily freed from their influence. Mrs. Abernathy grabbed her, pulling her toward the trapdoor, but their path was blocked by a writhing mass of shadows that had surged up from below. The entity in the frame was changing, its form destabilizing from the light, but already beginning to reform as the flash faded. James knew he had only moments before it recovered fully. Recalling Harrison's ritual, he began to recite the words written in the journal. "By light and shadow, by silver and glass, I bind you to your realm. What was taken must be returned. What was opened must be closed." The entity shrieked again, its form rippling violently. "You cannot banish us, photographer. We are as old as light itself." I offer this freely given token," James continued, gesturing to Elizabeth's lock of hair before the frame, "in exchange for what was stolen. Return my daughter's shadow and depart from this house forever." The entity seemed to expand, filling the entire attic with suffocating darkness. "We will take all of you," it roared. In that moment, Elizabeth broke free from Mrs. Abernathy and ran, not toward the mirror frame as James feared, but to his side. She grabbed his hand, her small fingers ice-cold in his grasp. "We'll face them together," Elizabeth said, her voice suddenly her own again, clear and determined, despite her still shadowless form. Something passed between father and daughter in that moment, a recognition that whatever influence the entities had held over Elizabeth, some essential part of her had remained untouched, fighting their control. "Finish the ritual, father," she urged. James nodded and continued the incantation, his voice growing stronger with each word. "By the bonds of blood and love, I reclaim what is ours. No shadow, no substance, no soul of this family belongs to you. The entity's form contorted as if in pain. From its writhing darkness, a small, distinct shadow began to separate, a child-shaped silhouette that James immediately recognized as Elizabeth's. "She is ours!" the entity shrieked, trying to reabsorb the separating shadow. "Now, James!" Mrs. Abernathy shouted, tossing him a small object. Emily Blackwood's hand mirror, its surface still covered in black paint. "Use this!" Acting on instinct, James positioned the mirror to catch the faint light coming through the attic window, then angled it to reflect that light directly into the empty frame. Where the beams struck the swirling darkness, it created a small opening, a window of normal space amid the shadow stuff. "Elizabeth's shadow," he commanded. "Return to your rightful owner." The child-shaped shadow trembled, caught between the entity's pull and James's command. Elizabeth stepped forward, reaching out toward her shadow with desperate longing. "Please," she whispered. "I'm not complete without you." At her words, the shadow suddenly broke free, flowing across the attic floor toward Elizabeth. As it reached her, it seemed to leap upward, attaching itself to her feet and spreading to match her form perfectly once more. The entity howled in rage. "If we cannot have her, we will destroy you all." The darkness began to spin like a tornado, breaking apart the attic roof and sending debris flying in all directions. James grabbed Elizabeth and pushed her toward the trapdoor. "Go! Get out of the house!" Mrs. Abernathy helped Elizabeth down the ladder while James faced the raging entity. He still held Emily's mirror, and now he understood its true purpose. The black paint didn't just keep the entities out, it could send them back. "Harrison Blackwood was a fool," James shouted over the howling wind. "He tried to use you, to bargain with you. I won't make that mistake. This ends now." With all his strength, he hurled the painted mirror directly into the center of the empty frame. The moment the two objects connected, a deafening implosion rocked the house. The swirling darkness was sucked into the frame with tremendous force, taking with it all the shadow tendrils that had filled the house. For a brief moment, James saw faces in the retreating darkness, twisted, inhuman visages contorted in rage and hunger. Among them was a small, sad face that he recognized from the photographs. Emily Blackwood, forever trapped between worlds. Then the darkness vanished entirely, leaving behind only the empty mirror frame, now containing Emily's small hand mirror, embedded in its center like a seal. The sudden silence was broken only by the creaking of the damaged house, settling. James stumbled down the ladder to find Elizabeth and Mrs. Abernathy waiting at the bottom, both wide-eyed but unharmed. "Is it over?" Elizabeth asked, her voice small. James looked at her feet, where her shadow stretched normally across the floor, responding correctly to the hallway light. "Yes, sweetheart, I think it is." Mrs. Abernathy wasn't so certain. The Blackwoods thought they'd escaped too when they fled this house, but the entities found them eventually. That's why we never heard from them again. "They found them because Harrison took something with him," James said, understanding dawning. "His camera equipment, mirrors, and silver nitrate. He unwittingly created new portals wherever he went." "So what do we do?" Mrs. Abernathy asked. James looked around at the house, their home which now felt irrevocably tainted. "We destroy every mirror, every photograph from the attic. We seal the mirror frame in the wall and never remove it, and then we leave," Elizabeth finished for him. "We find a new home." The three made their way downstairs and out onto the porch, where they stood together looking at the house. In the moonlight, it seemed almost innocent, just an old Victorian in need of care, not the battleground for an otherworldly confrontation. "I'll call Margaret tonight," James said. "Tell her it's safe to bring Thomas home, but only to pack. We'll put the house up for sale immediately." "No one will buy it if they know the truth," Mrs. Abernathy warned. "Then we won't tell them everything," James replied. "Just enough to ensure they're careful with mirrors." That night, as James sat in his study writing a detailed account of everything that had happened, a warning for future owners or anyone who might face similar entities, he found himself repeatedly glancing at his own shadow, grateful for its mundane presence. Elizabeth, now safely asleep in her parents' bed, had described what it felt like to lose her shadow. It was like forgetting who I was, piece by piece, like something essential was being drained away. The entities had not just been taking shadows, James realized. They had been harvesting identities, selfhood, souls. A week later, the Harris family departed Millbrook. They left behind a sealed attic, every mirror removed from the house, and a letter for the next owners with simple instructions. No mirrors in the attic, no photography in the house, no removing the plaster from the north wall, where an old mirror frame is permanently sealed. They also left Harrison Blackwood's journals and research with Mrs. Abernathy, who promised to ensure it would never fall into curious hands. Years later, long after the Harris family had settled in Ohio and the events in Pennsylvania had faded to uncomfortable memories, James received a letter from Mrs. Abernathy. An archaeological dig near their old house had unearthed something disturbing, a collection of ancient silver mirrors dating back to pre-colonial times, buried in a ritual formation. The accompanying artifacts suggested the native peoples had been attempting to contain entities they called the Shadow Eaters. The land, it seemed, had been cursed long before Harrison Blackwood built his house and filled it with mirrors. The entities had been there all along, waiting for someone to provide them with the means to cross over. Mrs. Abernathy's letter ended with a warning. They are ancient, and they are patient. They exist wherever light casts shadows. Be vigilant, Mr. Harris. Some doors, once opened, can never be truly closed. That night, James gathered his family in their cozy Ohio living room, where no mirrors hung on the walls, and photographs were few and carefully selected. Elizabeth, now a young woman of 16, sat beside him as he read Mrs. Abernathy's letter aloud. "Are we still in danger, Father?" she asked when he finished. James looked at their shadows, cast by the warm lamplight onto the far wall, normal, natural extensions of their physical forms. "I don't think so," he said, "but we'll continue to be careful." Margaret, who had accepted the supernatural events with remarkable composure, squeezed her husband's hand. "Whatever comes, we face it together, as a family." Later, as James prepared for bed, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the bathroom's small, necessary mirror. For just a moment, so briefly he could almost convince himself he'd imagined it, he thought he saw his reflection smile independently, a cold reminder that some things could never be fully banished, only contained. He quickly covered the mirror with a cloth, a precaution that had become second nature to the Harris family. Some habits, like the entities themselves, cast long shadows. In his dream that night, James found himself back in the Pennsylvania attic, standing before the empty mirror frame. Within it, Emily Blackwood's face appeared, no longer trapped with the entities, but seemingly free, at peace. "Thank you," she whispered, "for finishing what my father started, for understanding what he never could, that some prices are too high to pay no matter what you've lost." James awoke with tears on his face, but a sense of closure in his heart. The shadows had been banished, at least from his family's life. Yet he knew they remained out there in the world, waiting in the space between light and dark, seeking reflections through which they might return. As dawn broke over their Ohio home, James made a silent promise to the morning light. His family's shadows would remain their own, now and always. Some boundaries were never meant to be crossed, some realms never meant to meet. In the eternal dance between light and shadow, vigilance was the only true protection. And in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, the old Victorian house stood empty once more, its secrets sealed behind plaster and silence, waiting for the next family to ignore the strange warning left by its previous owners. The warning about mirrors, shadows, and things that hunger for substance in a world of reflections.